Welcome to the Web of Why, where we weave the tapestry of holistic health and herbs. So if you are new to the Web of Why, this is my new weekly live streaming that I'm doing on Wednesdays where we talk about all things plants. And today I wanted to talk about ethics in terms of wild harvesting. And the reason I really wanted to talk about this now is because things are starting to melt and thaw where I am. Plants will soon start to emerge as well. And when that happens, of course, the idea of foraging and wild harvesting is sort of forefront on people's minds. They've been, stuck in their houses and they're ready to get out and start playing with plants. And I think this year, especially with everything that's going on in terms of food prices and inflation, I think we're going to see a lot more people who are going to start to venture out into the world of foraging and wild harvesting. And if you haven't seen my YouTube video on how we're navigating inflation, I do recommend that you check that out. There are some pretty good tips and tricks in there. Foraging not being one of them, of course, in hindsight, we probably could have mentioned that too. But I wanted to talk about the how to go about doing this in an ethical way that has the least amount of impact to the planet and to the herbs and the plants that we want to be using, ensuring that that population, of course, continues to thrive and grow and exist long after we've been there to wild harvest. And so the ethics of this, I think, are really very important. So one of the first questions I want you to ask yourself before you go venturing out into the wilds, and wild harvesting is there a need? Because sometimes we tend, there can be a propensity for seeing something online, maybe a blog post or a YouTube video or a Pinterest recipe, and you perhaps are creating a need where there is none. So, for example, when I go out wild harvesting for tinctures and things like that, I'm always checking my stocks and store levels first before I venture out to see if there are actually any plants that I really do need. And instead of going out and just harvesting everything I can, lay my eyes on, I'm ensuring that the harvesting that I'm doing fulfills a need of some kind. So perhaps it is ethical foraging in terms of looking for food, or maybe you're building your own home apothecary of some kind. It's really important that when we go out, we know that there's some kind of a need and we're not just sort of willy-nilly harvesting plants that could potentially go to waste later on. And that's something to be really kind of cognizant of. Another area that I often bring up to my students and people who decide to come and learn with me is to really be aware of the species that you are going out to harvest or forage for, and that it is not considered at risk or endangered in your area. And it is sad to say that the list of endangered and at-risk species in North America is growing every single year. And as stewards of the land, it is our responsibility to ensure that these species are able to perpetuate and be around for decades, centuries to come, so that future generations can utilize their benefits as well. So it's really important that we look into that. A really great resource would be United Plant Savers. You can hop onto their website and they actually have a pretty up-to-date list of what's considered at-risk and endangered. And I do believe they break it down by region. And it's really important that we're not going out and adding extra stress to a species. A really great example in the 1980s in North America, echinacea, the news and the use of echinacea kind of spread like wildfire. And it was being used by everyone everywhere, and wild species of echinacea quickly became depleted to the point where it is endangered in some areas and at risk in others. And so it's important that we're aware of that. Plants like slippery elm is another really great example. Wild leeks in some areas are considered at risk or endangered. So it's really important that we know that before we venture out. Another thing that's really important, kind of falling along the lines of, is there a need? Do you have a need for what it is you're going out and foraging and harvesting for, but also to only take what you need? And I have a lot of tools in my tool belt, like things like spring scales. So I am assured that what I'm taking will be used in entirety and in completion by the time I get back from my foraging and wild harvesting adventures. So ensuring that you really only take what you need. If your family only needs 500 milliliters of a tincture to get you through an entire season, then there's no need to harvest enough plant material to make liters and liters, especially if it's just going to end up in the compost when you get home. So a spring scale, if anyone has ever done any fishing, I should have brought it here with me. I don't have it, but you can get smaller spring scales so you can actually weigh your bag when you're out in the wild or out in the woods foraging, so that way you know that you have the rough amount of plant material that you're going to be needing when you get back home to process it.
Are you ready to take your herbal learning to the next level? To dive into the world of plant-based wisdom and to walk the path of a plant worker? If you are, I invite you to check out Weavers of Plant Wisdom, which is my new monthly membership platform where we explore all topics plants. I hope to see you there.
Another area that I want everyone to be aware of in terms of ethical wildcrafting or foraging is whether you're legally allowed to be on the land that you're on and whether you're legally allowed to harvest there. One of the challenges and beautiful things of living where I live in Kawartha Lakes is that most of the wild areas that I am surrounded by are provincial or crown lands. And so it is, oh, sorry, not crown lands, conservation lands. So conservation authority and provincial lands where it is not legal to forage or wild harvest at those locations. And so it's really, you have to be very mindful of that. And it can be tricky to find locations to harvest at. So hopefully you've got some friends with large acreage or crown land. Again, check your bylaws and make sure you know. But you don't want to be venturing onto private property for sure. And you don't want to be harvesting in areas that are considered conservation authority areas. So that is one area I want you to keep in mind of before you head out foraging. Something else that I really want to draw your attention to in terms of ethics and wild harvesting and wildcrafting is exploring alternatives. So I'm going to go back to echinacea as a really great example, because traditionally echinacea was a plant where we harvested the root, meaning of course that we dug up the plant and killed it in order to make medicine. And so many herbalists are now starting to experiment with using the aerial parts of the plant, so i.e. the flowers or the leaves, in order to make medicine. And what we're finding is that those immune stimulating and antiviral properties, along with many of the other sort of lymphatic and depurative properties that we find in the root of echinacea, exist in the aerial parts as well. Now, when we harvest the aerial parts of a plant, if done so properly, we don't have to endanger that species. We don't have to put it under any stress or any duress of any kind, or killing it in this particular case. And so that allows us to still utilize its beautiful medicine without having to dig up the plant and harm it. So something else to consider when you're out foraging and wild harvesting. And I do see that I've got a question there. I'm going to answer that after, because I was planning on doing a whole second video on that, but I'll touch on it briefly on here as well. So I have seen your question. I will get to it in just a moment. Something else to consider when you're heading out, again, to forage and wild harvest is, can the land that you are on sustain your harvesting? And so what I mean by this, I have what I call the 10% rule, and this was what I was taught by my teacher, and I pass this along to those who who want to study with me and work with me. And the idea is that I will only take at most 10% of a population. So if I'm going out and I'm harvesting, let's say oxeye daisy as an example, and I'm looking at the land that I'm at, and I see 100 plants, that means I can only take 10, ensuring that this one will allow the species to continue to propagate and plants to pollinate and those types of things. And and it's also going to ensure that the species doesn't become sort of stressed out by suddenly someone coming in and wiping out 50% of the population. And so if I'm at a location and I'm looking around and it doesn't look like that this particular piece of land can sustain my presence there and the taking of 10%, I will not harvest there. And something else to consider is to look for signs of someone else having been there. And because if you take 10% and they've taken 10% and the person before them has taken 10%, you can see how quickly an area can become depleted. So if you're harvesting things like aerial parts, you're going to look for plants that have been deadheaded. That may happen in our gardens at home, but that doesn't usually happen in the wild. So it's a sure sign that someone has been there before you. We've got a good question about the potency between the root and the aerial parts of Echinacea. So I can touch on that. It is still kind of a new area of interest for many herbalists studying this because of the fact that Echinacea is an endangered and on the watch list in many areas of North America. And so is the root potentially more potent? Yes. That being said, if we work in formulation and we take other herbs and we combine, we can create a perfectly powerful little immune stimulating formula by doing just a little bit of extra work. That allows us to continue to be good stewards of the land, to make ethical choices when it comes to harvesting. So now, of course, an option with Echinacea is for you to grow it yourself. So you could grow a patch yourself, allow it to, spread and continue to grow for 3 or 4 years, and then harvest a select amount of it for the root. What I'm speaking of is predominantly associated with going out and foraging and wild harvesting. So that's something to be really aware of. So there are definitely some potency differences, but if I may be so bold, if we continue to harvest the way that we're harvesting, the plant won't exist and it'll be extinct, and then we'll be left with nothing. So I think it's finding these really interesting balances, maybe growing it yourself as being an option, or exploring, and that would be falling under that category of exploring alternatives. The alternative would be to grow it yourself. Now, we do want the plant to mature to at least, or the colony of plants to mature to at least 3 or 4 years before we start harvesting roots, but consider it a long-term investment, I guess. Another area to consider are clean harvesting locations. So say you found a really great spot, you're legally allowed to be there. There are plenty of plants for you to go and forage for. You want to ensure that land is clean. So when I mean clean, I mean that you don't want it to be within close proximity of commercial farms that spray. Ideally, you don't want to be harvesting on ditches and roadsides, especially if it's in unfamiliar areas and you don't know what your city puts on the roads, especially in the winter months. You don't want, if you're looking at a stream, you've got to be careful what it's downstream from, because our medicine is only as potent as the herbs that we harvest. And we have to also be very cognizant that if these plants have been exposed to toxins, pesticides, fungicides, chemicals of any kind, those are going to make their way into your medicine. And so ensuring your harvesting location is clean is another really great thing to have on your radar in terms of ethical foraging and ethical wild harvesting. So I hope that you have found this helpful. I know I've got that one question I want to get to in just a moment. As a herbalist that has been foraging and wild harvesting for almost a decade now, a little over a decade actually, I'm starting to see some alarming trends, especially with plants that they themselves are trendy. So a great example would be chaga. And chaga is, again, it's all over sort of mainstream natural health news. Everybody's talking about it. Every company is making, chaga hot chocolates and mushroom blends and using this plant and potentially using it to its own detriment. Because 10 years ago when I started foraging and wild harvesting, like I said, it's actually been longer than that, chaga was something I could find everywhere. Now I can find evidence of it, but what I am seeing is unethical harvesting practices. So I'm seeing chaga being taken from conservation lands. I'm seeing people taking the entire growth of chaga, as opposed to only taking a small portion. We have to, if we're not educated about the plants and plant allies that we're working with, we may not realize how long it took for that chaga growth, right, to actually form. It can take decades. And people going in and they're taking out entire chunks, and I've seen what looks like people are using screwdrivers based on the damage that's been done to the plant. And so it's something that we really have to be aware of. It's happening in Ontario with wild leeks. People are going in and they're pulling out the entire plant, including taking the bulb of the plant, instead of just harvesting a few of the leaves, wiping out entire colonies that can take decades to actually grow to the size that they are at. And so I really thought it was important to bring this to the forefront because, again, we're looking at rising food costs. People are going to start becoming worried, and they may decide to turn to the land to fill some of those needs. And we have to ensure that, 5 years of us going out and wild harvesting doesn't wipe pretty much everything off the planet, which is not the way we should be going. So I hope that you found this useful. Catherine, chaga has become very popular due to its immune tonic properties, its anti-cancer property. There's actually lots of research on it, so I do encourage you to look into it. And if you do decide to use it, ensure you're supporting companies that support ethical harvesting practices. It's really, really important. Now, there is a question that someone had is, what is your practice on the spiritual side of harvesting? And I had planned to do a whole video on the ethics regarding that. So the short answer is, do I ask the plant for permission or leave an offering? And yes, that is something that is a part of my practice. And that is a part of ethical harvesting for me in general, to seek permission. And that goes hand in hand where is there a need? And I think again, without going into too many details, because I have planned a future chat about this in more depth, but I think it speaks to the humility that we need to have as humans and understanding that we are not better than plants. And in fact, we need them for food and for medicine. So at the very least, there should be an equal exchange, a reciprocity of energy in which the plant is not feeling, again, over harvested, abused in any way, shape, or form. So for me personally, in my practice, the idea of asking permission is incredibly important and does weave into the ethics of wild harvesting. Thank you for joining me in this conversation about ethics in foraging and wildcrafting, and I will see you next week for another episode of The Web of Why.